again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. Thank you for being here. I am John, and straightforward, let's do it. What is a paranormal experience you have had? Serious. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My family has a cabin next to a lake in Vermont that we spend time at in the summer. One night, while sleeping in the upstairs bedroom, I hear what sounds like someone getting up to go to the bathroom. It was coming from right across the hallway outside my door, so I assumed it was my mom, usual occurrence. Oddly enough, no lights went on and no bathroom noises. The sound of footsteps just stopped. A minute later, I had this odd feeling that someone was standing at the half-open door to my bedroom, watching me. This feeling went on for minutes, until all of a sudden, the feeling of someone standing by the door turned into the feeling of someone standing directly over the bed. For the next 5 minutes, I had the terrible feeling that someone or something was looming over me, with their face mere inches from mine. The 5 minutes or so seemed to last forever. Suddenly, as soon as the feeling started, it abruptly ended. No retreating footsteps, no noise at all. Whatever it was just gone. The next morning, my family and I are eating breakfast at the table, and I still couldn't shake this feeling. Then my sister spoke up and asked, "Mom, what time was it that you got up to go to the bathroom last night? I could hear you up and walking around from the downstairs bedroom." Confused, my mom said that she never got up last night. My brother laughed and said, "Mom, we all heard you." Then my dad piped up and said, "No, your mom never got up. I didn't either." That's when I shared my experience. Freaked everyone out. When I was a kid, I had a dream about my grandfather, and he was saying goodbye to me. My mom woke me up to tell me that he had just died, and I hugged her to let her know that I knew already. She was petrified. I was his favorite grandchild, and I miss him every day. My sister and I shared a room when we were tweens, and we both swore that it was haunted. We'd hear strange sounds and see weird stuff out of the corner of our eye. There was also an oppressive feeling of something very wrong once the sun went down. My sister and I were way too old to be afraid of the dark, and we were fine with darkness anywhere else. Eventually, my sister refused to sleep in the room. Mom, of course, didn't think there was any way possible we had ghosts and thought this whole thing was ridiculous, until we went to summer camp. We were gone to this story from our mom. We had been gone for a couple of nights. Our dad was working graveyard, so Mom had the house to herself. She was getting ready for bed and heard laughter from our room. She heard it a few times before it struck her that we weren't there. Mom checked the room and the lights were on. Mom tried to convince herself that she was imagining things and turned the lights off. She heard the laughter again, and she went to check again. The lights were on again. Mom instinctively just said, "You kids go to bed," and she didn't hear them anymore. After that, Mom believed us, but we were still kind of stuck with the room. It was an old house that we had while we were saving up for a better place. My sister adopted a cat, which helped for some reason, but it was months before the cat would go into our room without flipping out, like literally ears pinned back, growling, hissing, and bolting out of the room like a bullet. We eventually were able to move to a nice home, and even Mom was too happy to leave. Back in 1984, when I was 10 years old, I was out shopping with my mother when she suddenly all but collapsed. Some people and I helped her to a nearby seat, and after a few seconds, she turned to me and said, "Your grandmother has died." We went home, a 30-minute drive, and upon arrival, she learned that her mother had indeed died half an hour before. To this day, it's the only inexplicable thing I've ever witnessed, but I have no doubt in my mind that there was some sort of link between the two of them that was broken that day. The bond between parent and child is very strong, we know that. But do you think that that bond can exist beyond this normal plane of existence that we otherwise experience every day? No one believes me when I tell this story, but whatever. Back when I was in high school, early 2000s, I went to Mexico with my ex and his family. We went 18 hours into Mexico to visit his sister-in-laws. When we got there, it was a weird experience for me because I'm black, and most people in their town had never seen anyone non-Mexican in their entire lives. To say strangers were interested would be an understatement. The third night I was there, I awoke to a feeling I was being watched. I turned over and saw an old Mexican woman staring at me, but not in a malicious way, more like curious or amused like everyone else. At first I thought it was my ex's mother-in-law, since we were staying at her house, so I called out to her in Spanish, but she didn't answer, and after a few moments, I realized I could see through her. Eventually, she walked out of the room, and I tried to shake it off and go back to sleep, but I couldn't. The next morning, I told my ex's sister what happened, and she says, "Oh, you saw her?" I'm like, pardon the F? And she goes on to tell me that while she's never seen La Vieja, her husband has a couple of times, and the last time he saw her, she almost led him to his death. She tells me that one night a few years ago, they were once again visiting his mother and staying in her house. In the middle of the night, her husband wakes up to the feeling he's being watched. He sees a woman that looks a lot like his mother standing in the doorway. He calls out to her, asking why she's awake at this hour, but she doesn't answer. Instead, she walks out of the room and eventually goes outside. Half asleep and in a trance, he follows, calling out to her again and again with no answer. SN. His mother's house is located in the valley between two mountains and is so isolated she still draws her water from a well in her front yard. So, my ex's brother-in-law is following this woman, thinking it's his mother, and eventually follows her outside. He runs after her and sees her jump directly into the well. Panicked, he begins to jump in, thinking he's saving his mother from drowning. But the moment before he jumps in the well, he fully awakes and realizes there's no splash, and the water at the bottom was completely still. If he would have jumped in, he would have drowned. They have no neighbors, and everyone else in the house was asleep. No one would have heard him scream for help. Needless to say, I packed my shit and went home early. F that. I used to see a little boy in the corner of my room mostly at nighttime when I was about 13 years old. I could see and sense that he wasn't a living human being, and his clothes were really old-fashioned. I was never really scared because he always had a positive energy around him. Can't really explain it. I talked to him sometimes, and he told me his name, etc. Can't really remember any of the things he told me anymore, but the most interesting thing happened during a fight between me and my mom. My cousin and her mother were visiting us at the moment, and I never told them about this boy, since ghosts aren't really a light discussion over dinner kind of thing. At some point, I'd had enough of the fight and got out, slammed the door behind me, and for some reason went to a parking garage under our house to chill and cool down for a few hours. My mom, cousin, and aunt went looking after me and eventually found me. My cousin told me that she had got the idea to look from the parking garage after she had seen a young blonde boy with weird clothes standing by a fence that was right next to a door to the garage. She told me that the boy just stood there, and when he got her attention, he jumped over the fence and disappeared. Only that behind the fence there was a thick bush full of big thorns, and there's no way a little boy would have just jumped in and let alone not made a sound after getting stabbed by thorns. I guess my friendly ghost wanted to help. My grandmother's sister was a nun, and she stayed with our family during her last years. She always sat on the terrace of our house overlooking the garden and streets. She loved staying there as she can watch the people go by. She died when my little brother was like 3 or 4. The terrace wasn't usually used by us ever since no one liked going up there. A year after, little brother and I decided to go up to the damned place. Halfway through the hallway, he stopped, pointed at where our grandmother always sat, and asked me, "Who's that? Is that one of our grandmas?" When I was 8 or 9, my family volunteered at a place that basically purchased historical buildings and set them up like a huge outdoor showroom. All the volunteers were dressed up in period clothes for the building they staffed, so it was like getting shot straight back into the pioneer days. There were like 7 or 8 kids out there most weeks, so it became a Lord of the Flies situation. One day, we all wandered out into the open land between the show areas to a place that had this huge great oak tree. I was walking with another girl who stopped suddenly and froze up. I asked her what was wrong, and she just pointed and said, "Look." There was a beautiful woman there that neither of us had ever seen before in a purple Victorian dress, and she was dancing by herself. It took us both a second to process, and in that time she had completely faded away. We later found out that a third girl saw her too. Nobody has any explanation, and she wasn't a volunteer as far as anyone knows. Well, it could have been another volunteer, it could have been a family member of a volunteer, it could have been an art student, a photography student, or a Victorian ghost. I worked at a haunted house, and once when looking down the hall of one of our actors' exits, there stood a figure, like an all-black, somewhat transparent silhouette of a human standing motionless in front of me. I stared at the hall entrance and called my boss over and asked her to look down the hall, but didn't give any indication that I saw anything, so I wouldn't give her a false impression. When she looked, her expression was pure cold fear. "Who the F is that?" she said. I told her, "I don't know, but you see him too, right? I see through him. Who the F is that?" And before I could say anything more, it came full sprint at us. My boss screamed and ran away, but I was curious what it would do, so I stayed. It got right up to my face and just stopped, inches away from my nose, then suddenly dissipated into thin air. I still occasionally see my boss, and she confirms every time that we saw the same thing, and thinks I was an idiot for staying, but at the same time, it was cool. My maternal grandmother was dying in the hospital. She had a DNR, but my grandpa wouldn't let go. I was at school in the journalism room. This was 1997, and I didn't have a cell phone. Suddenly, I was overcome with a suffocating sadness, and I heard my grandmother tell me she needed Grandpa to tell her he would be okay, so she could finally pass. I called my mom at the facility and relayed the message. My mom was silent for a few seconds, and then agreed to pass on what I had said. In an hour, I got a call that Grandma had died. At her funeral, I was so devastated by grief and guilt, I was convinced I had killed her. As I sobbed, I felt two hands gently press on my shoulders from behind me. Again, I heard my grandma. She said she was grateful and thanked me for helping her move on. I immediately stopped crying, and the guilt lifted. We had some newly built dorms at the college I went to. We had a big room that was me and my roommate, a door to the kitchen, and there was a door to the other room where my other suite mate stayed. My girlfriend stayed there every night with me as well. One night, my roommates had left for the weekend, and it was just me and my girlfriend. We were watching a movie and we heard a chair drag across the floor in the kitchen, and then our door slowly closed. I jumped up and checked, and none of my roommates were home. Flash forward to about 2 weeks, and I'm staying in my dorm alone. Girlfriend and roommates gone. The power went out in my dorm, and it was storming very bad outside. I was laying there in a dead silent room when all of a sudden, the edge of my bed pushed down like someone sat on it. I felt this cold gust of wind blow on my neck, and I freaked out and jumped up and turned my phone flashlight on and proceeded to be scared shitless the rest of the night. Was at a beach house with my family when I was a kid. I shared a room with my siblings, and my big brother, already in his late teens, got the top bunk and I got the bottom one. Me, being very young, around 11 or 12, went to sleep while he was out with his friends, and my mom watching movies in the living room. I had a horrible nightmare and woke up gasping in a cold sweat and shivering, scared out of my mind. My brother somehow noticed it and calmed me down, hugging me, telling me it would be okay. It was just a dream. Didn't really see his face, but it was a masculine figure and voice, bigger than me, that came down from above me. In the morning, I went to thank him for that, and he was very confused. Said he didn't come home until early morning, and since it was so late, he slept in the other room, not to wake me. When I was around 13, I started getting a bad feeling around our house. There was a certain area I refused to go into, and I was terrified to close my eyes at night. I was always a nervous child, but this went far beyond that. There are a few incidents of note, and I'm going to share them in the order I remember them in. I was having a Skype call with my room with a friend, and at some point I left the room with the video chat still on, facing a somewhat shiny section of my bed frame. When I came back, my friend looked shaken. I asked him what had happened, and he explained that he'd seen a face pass by in the reflection while I was gone. We checked to see if there was any way to move the camera to where it showed his own face, and we couldn't find one. While looking for a game I'd lost, I went up into the bonus room of our house. For reference, this was a room above the garage, disconnected from the rest of the house, except through a narrow laundry room. I hated going up there. In most cases, I refused because it gave me the most horrible feeling. Some of my friends said even just going into the laundry room made them uncomfortable. After searching for a few minutes, I lost my nerve and went to head back down the stairs and get out of there. As I was heading down the stairs, I froze, an icy feeling in my gut, and started to turn around. Before I could, I felt the distinct impression of hands on my back shoving me. I just barely caught the handrail before I went tumbling and ran out of there like a bat out of hell. After the previous incident, I decided to put a line of salt down in the laundry room. I figured it couldn't hurt, and it'd be a good test to see if anything was actually happening or if I was just spooking myself. I put the salt down, and the very next day the feeling of dread had already dulled throughout the house. I could relax, at least somewhat, and the stuff that had been happening stopped, until I came home one day, and the feeling was back worse than it had ever been. My parents had hired a cleaner, who had swept up the laundry room. I was terrified of what might happen next, but couldn't bring myself to get that close to the source again. Not long after this, I started getting the same feeling I got from the bonus room in my own room. I could feel it coming distinctly from one corner of my room. I don't know how long it was there, but eventually I got used to it. I thought again that maybe I was just scaring myself. One night I laid down and closed my eyes, and after a little bit, as I was starting to drift off, my body tensed. I couldn't move or open my eyes as that feeling from the corner of my room got stronger and stronger. I felt a dip in the bed at my side, and for a moment nothing happened. I thought that maybe if I pretended to be asleep, whatever it was would go away. And then suddenly the feeling of hands were back and around my throat. I couldn't breathe, but I also couldn't move. My lungs burned, tears were rolling down my face, and I could feel myself starting to pass out. And just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't move a muscle until I finally fell asleep. The next day, when I looked in the mirror, there was bruising all around the front and sides of my neck. I was grateful wearing collars was my thing so that no one was suspicious about me wearing a thick one for a week until the bruises were gone. I threw salt absolutely everywhere in my room after that. I mean, if I was a kid, haunting or not, if I'm just throwing big piles and lines of salt all over the house, my mom would be like, "Clean this up," right? One night, my sister and I saw a black figure poke its head around a wall in our house looking at us. We were the only ones home. There were times I would hear children laughing when none were around. I've heard muffled voices coming from our TV when it was turned off. After I moved out of the house, my mom and sister woke up to one of the dining room chairs pushed up to the kitchen sink like someone who couldn't reach the sink would need. A few days before, I had my daughter and grandmother had emergency surgery and didn't wake up from it until a week later. She never really recovered from it, but did tell some of my cousins that she died when my daughter was born, and then she said she saw us driving home from the hospital. She had details she couldn't possibly know. She died a month after I had my daughter. Everyone in our family knows that when you die, you let everyone alive know you are okay. People get visited in dreams. I was visited by both grandmothers, and my sister was visited by our grandfather. They are very different from dreams and have left us very shaken and comforted. This was back in 2006, I think, so my memory is a bit hazy. For some backstory, I had a rough year, and I wasn't completely excited about the summer. Over the school year, I lost one of my first online friends to a terminal illness she had, and my dog to cancer almost back to back just before summer vacation started. So, it was an all-around bleak time for me. The only thing that really kept me going was music and video editing, which I try to utilize a lot with the video camera I got the year before. Fast forward to mid-July or so, and I'm taking my camera around my basement to test the different functions and features it had that I didn't tinker with much of on a throwaway disc. I wasn't planning on doing much with it, so I wasn't setting out to do anything spectacular with it. After about 30 minutes of recording random things, I hooked it up to get it finalized before I tossed it in my DVD player to see what I got. As I said, I wasn't expecting to get much of anything. Around the last few minutes, the disc skipped and was stuck on a single frame for a few seconds. This was in my kitchen, where to the right of the doorway is a bar counter, and besides that is our water heater closet. In the corner between the bar and the closet door, there was a blurry fuzz or shadow that resembled a German shepherd. My cousin, who was watching it with me, found it to be very weird. I started thinking about this again after my cat had to be put down back in November, since my partner and I talked to my mom about feeling like he's still around, to which she said she feels the same about our dog as well. She's mentioned feeling someone stirring in bed and laying beside her whenever she was alone, and our dog would always go to bed with us growing up.